Welcome back to this fourth session of the third week of Angular development course. In this section, we would learn what is data binding with components and also understand the life cycle of an Angular component. So what is data binding? So data binding helps us to bind the data from a component to the HTML DOM templates. So as I said earlier, a component is nothing but a mixture of HTML along with the TypeScript file, which has its own variable and other logic to manipulate the HTML. So data binding essentially means that a way to connect this TypeScript file to the HTML file. So data binding can be of two types. You can either do a one-way data binding, which means that you can manipulate the HTML DOM template if there is any change to the component, or you can have a two-way data binding, which I showed a demo to you earlier, wherein if you update something on your HTML as well, there could be a change in your component. So just to refresh your memory, we'll just go back to the sample application that we had earlier and see this in action. So I'm just coming back to the stackblitz.com and the application which we just put up to show this two-way data binding concept. So what is one-way data binding is? So I'm just going back yeah. In my app component.ts file, so here basically we have two components. One is your app component and one is the edit user component. So in my app component, I just go and edit the skill link to have skill link space just inc, just for example. You'll see that dynamically both my data, which is my model, and also my actual HTML template has been updated. So this is nothing but I'm just kind of projecting whatever is my variable name on the HTML. Okay. And over here, what I'm doing is inside my input, I'm just binding whatever is the individual object names here. So you see over here that whenever I change anything in my TS, automatically that comes in my HTML. So this is called as one-way data binding, meaning if anything changes in my logic or component file, that automatically gets transferred to the HTML. So this is called as one-way data binding. And how to achieve one-way data binding is you can do it through string interpolation, or you can use property binding or event binding. We'll come to it. The second part is the two-way data binding, which means that conversely, even if I change something on my HTML, my underlying data should get updated. Say for example, here instead of skill link inc, I just give SL. So you see that automatically even my underlying data is getting updated when I update my HTML. So this is called as two-way data binding. And if I have some logic which will again change this data, so again my even my HTML data will get updated. So this is called as two-way data binding. So just to come back to the whiteboard, one-way data binding means the data just flows in one direction, which means that it could flow from your TS to your HTML or vice versa. And the second way is two-way data binding means there is a two-way connection between your HTML and your TypeScript file, meaning any change on TypeScript file will update your HTML, any change on HTML will update your TypeScript file. So I hope now you're clear on what is one-way data binding and two-way data binding. Okay, so coming back. So how can we achieve data binding is through these three ways. You can have string interpolation, you can have event binding, and you can have property binding. Okay. So let's try to understand each of these in detail. And before that, just as I summarized, two-way data binding allows the flow between both the sides, that is your HTML DOM template and your component as well. So two-way data binding, we would be doing a more in-depth review once we get into the forms and other things, which will be further down the course. So now let's jump back to a code and understand the string interpolation in this data binding concepts in a better way. So as we discussed earlier, we said that we'll just take the same lazy loaded module example that we did earlier and we'll just try to update this. So what I'll do is I'll just get into my app component.ts, and just before all this code that we wrote earlier, I'll just come to the app component.ts file and I'll just define a bunch of things for us to understand. So first I'll just define a variable called say name. And yeah, one more thing to remember is it's also important the way you define your variable names and class name is also important. So always remember that whenever there is a class name being defined, it will follow the Pascal casing, which means every particular word will start with a capital letter with no space in between. Whereas if you're defining any variable name or function name, it will be following the camel casing, wherein the first letter of the word will be lowercase and the subsequent words, the first letter of the words will be in capital case. Say for example, if I have to define a variable called first name, so in this case the first F will be capital, but the end of the name would capital name, okay, will be capital. And I can define a name over here. Say I just say SK, or maybe I just say skill. And similarly, I could define another variable called second name, and I can define it as link. Okay, just for demo purposes. Okay, so now my requirement is I want to bind these variables to my HTML. Okay, and always remember to add the semicolon as a best practice whenever you define any statement in your TypeScript or JavaScript. Okay, so now my requirement is I have to bind these variables to my HTML. So how can I do it? So in component, to bind any variable to your HTML template, you can use something called as string interpolation. Okay, so to directly bind it. So say for example, now I just defined a div over here. Okay, and inside this div I want to now show that variable name. How can I do? If I directly just put first name and like this, and if I try to render it on my HTML, you see that it exactly shows first name, because when your Angular renders any string over here, think that you're just trying to render the string over here just like any other string that you see here. So to ensure that your Angular is kind of like replacing this with the actual variable value, you need to enclose it within two curly braces. So in this case, if you come back, you'll see that now it has properly rendered skill over here, right? So this process of enclosing a variable name in two curly braces and giving that variable name in your HTML template is what is called as string interpolation, wherein what we say is we can render any string on the HTML using the variables from the component we have. Okay, so similarly, if I have to show the next name, which is the second name, all I need to do is just there are two ways to do it. Either in the same div, I can just concatenate two name, and here it comes. So skill link, what I've done is basically using this plus operation, I've just concatenated the two letters and I've shown it. You don't want to concatenate it, so what you can do is you can just define another curly braces and define second name. So in this case also it works fine. Okay, or if you want to put the second name in a different div, that is also fine. It's up to you. So basically the moral of the story is, if you have some variables in your component and you want to display it on the HTML, the first way to do it is by using the string interpolation method. So I hope this is now clear to you. So the next part we will understand is what is the, if you go back to the slides, you will see that we also saw there are two things we can do. One is the event binding and one is the property binding. Okay, so let's also try to understand what each of these means. So if you come to your, let's take the same example. Okay, so what I'll do over here is we have defined two buttons over here, right? When you click on button one, we just have defined the router link and we directly navigate to lazy one. And for the button two, we just navigate to lazy two. So now we'll define one more button over here. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll do two things over here. Okay, so if you remember the previous example, right? So if I want to read something about the attribute directives, right? Where we said if we can manipulate the values of a particular tag attribute value, and that will ensure that the whatever is the DOM attribute values are getting updated. So same logic applies here as well for property binding. So what property binding means is, so say assume I have some element or some DOM element in my screen. So say assume in this case it's my button. Okay, and I want, so let's just rename this to property binding just for our understanding. And what we will do is we will just define a property in such a way that if say I want to disable this button when my first name is empty. Okay, so when I say first name is empty, I mean that if my first name is not defined, this button should be disabled. So how to ensure that, check if my first name is empty? So when you give this any when you wrap any attribute name within square bracket, that means that you're doing a attribute binding or a property binding. And after that, when you whatever things you give inside this quotes, that means that that is a condition which you're checking. Okay, so in this case, if we don't give this exclamation mark, right, it only means that if my first name is defined and it has some value, then you can disable this button. So that's what this means. So if you go back to the browser, you'll see that now my property binding button is disabled, and that is because your first name is defined over here and it has some value. So that is why this is getting disabled. But my requirement is this should only be disabled if it is undefined. Okay, or the data is not there. So in that case, what I'll do is I'll put a negation symbol or a exclamation symbol before it. So this is called a negation symbol, which means that if I have to check if something does not exist, how can I do it is just by adding this exclamation sign before it. Okay, so when I do that and now save it, you see on my DOM now that this button is now enabled, right? So this is called as property binding, and it does not only apply for disabled. You can add it for a ton of different features. So say for example, let's take some other tag as well. So maybe let's take something like a div, for example. Okay, and for this div, so just assume that I want to give a role for this div. Okay, And a role is nothing but a HTML attribute which just defines like what is that particular section doing. Okay, so what I'm doing right now is, and as you can see over here, now it is throwing me error that this cannot bind role to div, it's not known property. So for such kind of errors, see, there may be a few properties of HTML which cannot be directly bound. So in those kind of scenarios, all you need to do is just add this attr dot role, that name. So in case if you see error in your console while trying to bind any built-in properties, so all you need to do to resolve it is just add this attr dot. Okay, so that will ensure that this gets dynamically added by your compiler at the runtime. So what I want to do now is I will first do a check. Okay, so to this attribute dot role, I will just first check if first name is defined, and if it's so, I would say that give this role as section. If not, I will just give it a role of alert. Okay, and I'll just give pass some text. I would say this as div role property binding. Okay, so I just give the name of div role property binding. I come back to my browser, I'll see that this is defined. And how to check if that role is defined? You just right click on this, go to inspect. On this div, you'll see now a role attribute is defined, and now it has the value of section. And why it has the value of section? Because here we have defined if the first name is valid and it has some value, then give it the name of section. If not, give it the name of alert. So how to check if this is working properly? I will just add the negation value to it. So can you tell me like what will be the value of role that is added? Because initially we said if first name is defined, give it section, if not alert. But now we are telling if not first name, then give it the name section and else alert. So in this case, if you go back and see in your DOM, you will check that this div is now having the value of alert. And why is that so? It will first check like what is the value of this. It will check first name is defined, negation of defined is undefined. And so for undefined, the value that will be set is alert. So that is how you work around with this property binding. And as I said, you cannot memorize all the properties that you have. So that's why I said as a prerequisite, you should be knowing HTML a bit. So anything in your like in HTML tag that you can bind it using this square bracket, and you can define the conditions or like whatever operations you want inside this. So this is the concept of property binding. So why we call it a property binding is because there is a variable which is defined in your component, and you are now binding that variable using some conditions to a property of your HTML DOM element. So that is why this is called as property binding. Okay. So the next thing that we need to understand is event binding. So what is event binding is, see, if you saw both a string interpolation and attribute binding or property binding, both of these are flowing basically from TypeScript file to the HTML file, right? But what if like we want to catch something and interpolate something from the browser? Like say for example, if my user has clicked or performed some action on the browser on the HTML, and that change I want to now incorporate in my TypeScript file or into my model. To handle those kind of scenarios, we have something called as event binding. Okay, so what is event binding is, I'll give you a simple example. So let's take the same button that we created earlier. Okay, and what we'll do now is we'll just create another button. Okay, and to this button we'll just add a click event. Okay, so what I've done right now is forget the error, we'll fix it in a while. So just understand that what you have done. So every HTML button element or any user interactable element, it will give you a default option to like capture that user action. So a button, what a user can do is click, right? So what I've done right now is I have just added a click event to it, and just to make you understand, property binding will start with a square bracket, but an event binding will start with a round bracket. So anything that you see in a round bracket means it's an event binding. Okay, meaning on any user action, this particular function will get triggered. So what I'm saying over here is, for this button on click, just trigger this function, and whatever is the current event, pass it as an argument. Okay, and why it is throwing a error over here is because we have not yet defined this handle click function. So what I'll do is I'll just go back to the TypeScript file. Here in my class file, I'll just define this handle click function. Since it has the argument of event passed from HTML, I'll just do that. And what I'll do here is I'll just do alert of event. And similarly, what I'll do is I'll also just change the first name to, and you see that this throwing error over here, because if you are using an argument to a function, it is expected that you use it. So just to get around this error, we'll just console log it, and also to make you aware like what are the things that are coming inside this event. Okay, and one quick note about this console log is, whenever you are writing your program, like your even like when you are experienced and you want to until you get a decent experience, so you want to understand what are the things that is being the data that is being passed and that is being done. What you can do is you can simply console log it. Okay. And here if you see now my the event is still throwing error. It is telling that it has implicitly as any type. So for us for now it's not an issue. So what we can do is we can just give it a type of any, and that should be fine for now. Okay. But if you want to fix it, you can also give it the type of event. But for now, for demo purpose, I'm just giving it a type of any. So this way I said TypeScript has a strong static typing and it is strongly typed. So meaning that it will strongly check that what is the types, the data type of each parameter and argument, and if there is any mismatch or potential warning, it will throw you error. Okay. So now let's go back to the browser and see what happens. So I have this event binding. Okay. Let me go to the console before, and I'll just my console. To clear the console, you just click on this. Now I just click on this event binding. So you see that now I got an alert that event binding is working, and also in my console you'll see that I got this click event now. So where this click event will be useful for you is if say specifically you want to capture which coordinate of the screen did your user click. So here I can get that what is my x coordinate, what is my y coordinate, and all that thing. So if there are some real time event, or you're doing some graphics for which the user click is also important, the position is also important, you can use this event. Similarly, you're typing something and you want to capture which key the user typed or what is the value. So even those kind of scenarios, you can use the event values in your function. And one more thing to understand over here is as I clicked on this, okay, in my TypeScript, I'm also changing the value of this first name. Okay. And what we can do over here is, give me a minute. Yeah. Okay. So just to give you a understanding of what is happening. So now just observe what is doing. So here what we did earlier was we just kind of concatenated the first name and the last name, right? Now let me click on event binding. Let's see what happens. You'll see that this skill link has got updated to whatever new name we given, right? So why did that happen is when the user clicked on this button, we have bound this click event to a function, right? And inside this function, what we are doing is we are now changing the template variable, the model name of first name to skill link. And observe one more thing. When you declare any variable for the first time, right, you don't give this. Okay, so there you just define the variable name as it is. And again, when you are going to manipulate that variable name further down in your program, you will use this dot that variable name. And why we use this is, this means that to the current instance of that component. Okay, so that's why we say that this dot first name, and even if this handle click we have again called somewhere in the program, we would say this dot handle click and pass the event. So that is how you do it. The first time you declare any variable or function, you don't give this, but again the next time you call it, you kind of reassign the value or call it, you have to add this keyword of this dot. Okay. And if you're not familiar with object oriented concepts, I would strongly recommend that you also go through and brush up the concepts of class and inheritance and instantiation of object oriented paradigm. So with that, I'm sure that now you understood what is property binding, event binding, and string interpolation. So this is what is how this is how you kind of pass the data both between your HTML and TypeScript. And two-way data binding, as I said, is any changes to your HTML will dynamically update your model, and any changes to your model will dynamically update it in your text. So this is predominantly used in form-based screens, so which will be covering detailed during the further point of time. Okay. So coming back to the PPT. So I'll just walk you through whatever we did so far from the slide. So property HTML is nothing but essentially it's a markup which instructs how to render a page, as we saw. DOM, which is nothing but a document object model, is what the browser constructs from this HTML and uses to render a page, and Angular manipulates the DOM properties and not the HTML properties. So the main concept to understand over here is Angular manipulates the DOM properties and not the HTML properties. So what it means over here is, let's try to understand it from the whiteboard. So there are two things that you need to understand over here, right? One is the DOM and the second is the actual HTML. See, a DOM is nothing but what your browser constructs based on your HTML tag, right? And it creates kind of a object model, which is kind of a hierarchical structure, right? And this DOM is what then gets rendered into your browser. Okay. So what happens is your Angular, what it does is it will, whatever changes you do to the property, event binding and all that thing, it will go and directly update this DOM structure over here, and this in turn would then get rendered into your browser. So that is what is the important concept you need to understand over here. So going ahead, property binding, we saw that it uses a square bracket, and say for example in this scenario we say button type button click alert and disable true. So this disable true is what is nothing but your property binding, and this Round bracket over here is what is the event binding, and event binding, as I said, allows you to pass the data from the HTML to your component. Now, next is a very important concept called the component life cycle. Okay, so just like how any humans go through a life cycle process, like right from their kid till their old age, similarly, even a component has a life cycle. Okay, so let's try to understand that. So every component in Angular goes through a series of phases, right from its creation to its destruction in the following order. So first, the constructor is invoked, then ng on changes, then ng on init, ng do check. Inside ng do check, we have four things, which is ng after content init, ng after content check, ng after view init, ng after view check, and finally your ng on destroy. Don't worry, I know it will sound too intimidating on the first attempt, but don't worry, we'll just destructure all this thing and try to understand it in a very simple fashion. So let's first try to understand and break it on a high level. So if you see, the first Angular lifecycle which you will encounter is ng on change. So what is ng on changes? Ng on changes will be called on the first time when your component is created and whenever there is change to any of its input properties or bound events. What it means, I'll give you a real world example. So coming back to our this example which we did earlier, right? So initially you will see that this property over here is called a skill link, right? But when I click on this event binding and I click on this OK, you see that dynamically now my component has updated the value. How did that happen, right? So that has happened because ng on change was triggered internally, which caught that this variable has changed, and hence it has updated the HTML value of it as well. So that is what is the use of ng on change. Next is ng on init. So what is ng on init is, it will be called once the component is initialized. Okay. So as I said earlier, if you go to the previous slide, you will see that, first your ng on change is called, like whenever there's any change or first time the component is initialized. After that, ng on init is called. After that, your ng do check and ng on destroy is called, right? So ng on it is called right after your ng on changes, and here is where, like if you want to do some initial variable assignment or you want to do some check, you add it over here. Next is the ng do check. So ng do check is like whenever there's any change detection cycle, like if you want to define some custom change detection algorithm, you should be using this. But usually what happens is, if you are defining ng on change in your component, you cannot also define ng do check with it as well. So you have to only define either one of them. By default, we normally use ng on change because we don't want to again define our own change detection cycle. But if you have some complex application and you want to fine tune or handle those mechanism by yourself, you can also do it using ng do check. Okay. The final thing that gets called is the ng on destroy. So ng on destroy gets called just before your Angular destroys the particular component. Okay. And normally in the ng on destroy, we do some cleanup operations. So if you want to just unsubscribe some observable, or you want to clean up some variable name, so those kind of things can be done in the ng on destroy lifecycle loop. And similarly, as we said, ng do check internally has four different life cycles. So what are those are? One is ng after content init. So this is like, once your external content is being inserted into your current component, this is called. After that, there's something called ng after content check, which is like, once your content is inserted, it will check it whether if all the content is correct, properly rendered or not. After that, you have something called after view init, which means like, once the content of the component itself and the children are initialized, this gets called. And finally, there's something called as after view check, which means like, once the content is checked and rendered, this gets initialized. So I know this looks like a bit intimidating, so let's directly jump into the code and understand it in the real time world. Okay. So coming back to our code, right? So as I said, Angular has a lot of lifecycle hooks. So first, let's try to understand it in the whiteboard, and then we'll get into the code. So the first thing you need to understand is, there are two ways in which, like your component can be initialized, right? Like two scenarios, I would say. So one thing is like, you directly land in a route. So maybe like, slash like, irctc.co.in. So which is nothing but your home page. So in this scenario, what happens is, there would be some app component.ts, which will then load all the content in your screen. This is one scenario. Second scenario could be that in your current component, there could be a bunch of other component which can get called, right? So in this scenario as well, there are cases like, your parent component will have its own lifecycle hooks running, and each of your components internally would have its own lifecycle hooks running, right? You're getting my point, because every component has its own lifecycle hook attached to it. So even if like, you have one parent component, inside that you have three different components, each of these would have its own lifecycle hooks running inside for that particular component. Okay. And the way this works is, on a high level, is first time any component is called, the constructor gets initialized. So this is a very important interview question. Like they might ask you what gets called first. Is it the constructor, or is it the ng on change, or the ng on init? So your answer to that should be that first the constructor always gets called, because if you see our code also, right? whenever you define a class, right after that you can define the constructor. So a constructor is what will help you to initialize the class, and if you want to do some initialization or define your dependencies, you can do over here. This is what gets first called whenever your components get created or called for the first time. Okay, and after the constructor is called is when after what is ng on change gets triggered, called for the first time, and after that there is something called as ng on in it, and after that there is something called as ng do check. But as I said earlier, if you're using ng on change, you cannot use ng do check. So these both are only one can be present in a component. If you're using ng on change, you cannot use ng do check. If you're using ng do check, you cannot use ng on change. Internally, ng do check has 4 different lifecycle hook, as you saw in the slide over here. So they are like ng after content init, ng after content checked, ng after view init, and ng after view checked. So usually what the component lifecycle we use the most is ng after view init. Okay. So I will give you a few scenarios for you as well. So coming back, and finally what gets called is ng on destroy. So this is called at last whenever you have any component which is going to get called out. Say for example, I'm going to now navigate from route 1 to route 2, or I'm going to change my route. In that case, this ng on destroy will get called at last. Okay. So now let's come back to the code and understand how this works. Okay. So to make you understand, what I'll do is I will first write something in the constructor. So I'll just say console.log I am called. Okay, so just to ensure that we are able to see that this constructor is really getting called or not, what I'll do is I'll go to my application. I'll just refresh my screen once. So you'll see that it is telling that I am called first constructor, right? So now, as I said, whenever your application is first initialized, the next lifecycle hook that gets called is your ng on change. So why we have all this lifecycle hook? That is another question that you may have. If what is the use of having all this lifecycle hook? So main use of all this lifecycle hook is, so say at any particular point of time you want to do some operation. See, if you see, there are basically 3 phases of your application, right? One is when when you initialize it, second when there is some change to it, and third when it is getting destroyed. So on a high level, these are the 3 things that happens in your application. So now let's assume on whenever your component is initializing, you want to say assign some variable value to it. Okay, and whenever there is some change, you want to say run some function. Okay, and similarly when you are destroying it, you want to clean up some variable name. Okay, so if you have to do all this operation, the only way you can do it is by using the lifecycle hooks. Okay, so that is why we have all this lifecycle hooks in our Angular. And the same concept also applies to other frameworks as well. So even if you use something like a React library, there also you have this concepts of lifecycle hooks. Okay, so whenever you want to do some operation at particular stage of a component, you use the lifecycle hook. So this is also an important concept which you need to understand. So coming back, now say now no, I want to use ng on change. So how can I use ng on change? Okay, so one way of using ng on changes, the only way of using ng on changes, first you have to import the ng on change function to your particular component. So what I'll do over here is I will just do on change. Okay, so this is how you import the any particular core Angular feature to your application directly. So just go to the import of @Angular core and just type that particular the utility which you require. And after you do that, the next thing that you do is you do implements on changes, and after that here is where you then call ng on changes, and here I'll just do another console log. Okay, so just understand what I've done right now. So whenever I want to use the ng on change cycle in my application, all I need to do is first I need to import that ng on change into my import, right? And after that, I need to, in my class, I need to add this keyword of implements on change. And after that, I need to define this function called ng on change. This is a keyword, so you have to use the same name. And inside that, there will be an argument called changes of the type simple change. Again, this simple change gets auto imported because I'm using Angular language service. That's why it's auto imported, or else you can manually type it. So what it means is every time there's a change, I'll be getting a change event, like a change object, which is of this type, simple changes. Okay. And what this colon void means is this will not return me any value. It will just perform some operations and leave it over there. And inside this, if I want to perform something, some operation, I can do it over here. I'm just doing a console log for your understanding. As we develop more application, we will be writing some serious code. But for now, just for your understanding, I'm just doing a console log. Okay. So now let's see what happens. I just go to my application, the same application we wrote. We'll see that first your constructor is called, right? And here now nothing else happens. Now what if I do a event binding, right? So again over here you see that nothing is happening. Why is that so? So now you may ask, like, though I'm clicking on this event binding and this value is changing, why am I not getting the ng on change in my console? So the answer for that is, if you look closely at what I said, ng on change will only get triggered when the input to this particular component is changing. What I mean by that is, app component currently has no external input, meaning, see, actually in the real world scenario, when we develop any application, what happens is, like, you have a component and you give it a bunch of inputs. I'll just give you a real world example. I just have a custom component created. Say I'll just give it a name of, say, something like, blog, for example. Okay, and here to the blog I can give it a input called as name, and to this name I pass, like, a variable called as blog dot name, something like that. And I could have also something like, heading, and I could give it like blog dot heading, so on and so forth. Okay, so just assume that we created a component called blog, and this blog has an input called name and heading, and this is the object name that is being passed to it. So when does this ng on change gets triggered is only when you change these names will that get triggered. But if internally there are some changes in your application alone, this will not get triggered. So that is why, like, that's the reason you don't see this getting triggered even when I'm clicking on event binding, because this event binding is just internally a part of component and there's no input to this component that is getting changed, because here we are not provided any input to this particular component. Okay, I hope that makes it clear. And how to pass the input and how to, like, get the input output, those things will be covered in a future session where we'll be talking about how to do communications between the component. Okay, so you can just ignore that part for now. What we'll do next is we'll try to understand how does this ng on destroy works, right? So for that, what I'll do is I'll just get into lazy one component just to show you how it works. So what I'll do is I'll just do ng, like the same concept I'll follow. So if I have to call, like, I have to implement ng on destroy, so there are two ways to do it. Either I can do it from import, or if I have to use autocomplete features, I can just do like on destroy over here, just click enter. Automatically you'll see that it got imported over here and here, and similarly I just need to do ng on destroy, automatically it will do the rest of the work for me. So here I can just do a console log, I am destroyed. Okay, so now what we will do is we'll go back to our code and we'll just click this module 1, because that is where we have defined lazy 1. Now lazy 1 works. What I'll do is I'll click on module 2, see what came in the console. I am destroyed. Why? Because now we have clicked on lazy 1, lazy 2, and now lazy 1 is unloaded from the browser, and that's why that ng on destroy got triggered. And similarly, like, if you define something for lazy 2, the same thing will happen. And even if you go back to the home screen, and if you are navigating away from the home screen also, the same thing will happen. Like, whichever component is getting unloaded and you define something in the ng on destroy, so that particular code will get triggered whenever, like, that cycle is being called. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. And after that we have a bunch of 4 lifecycle hook in this which will get called, right, which is part of the ng do check. And always remember that what I said, told you guys, is you cannot use ng on changes and do check in the same class, right? Say for example, here I already have defined ng on change, so now definitely I cannot go and implement ng do check in the same class. Okay, so if I do something like this, so this is not a valid Angular code, because this is not the way it should be done. Okay, though you not get error, but it is generally not recommended that you have ng on change and ng do check in the same file. And as I said, ng do check is for like implementing your own custom change detection cycle and all. So usually in your most of your scenarios, you won't encounter this scenario. However, one good thing about this is, as I said, that ng do check internally uses 4 different lifecycle hooks. You can anyways call one of these lifecycle hook in your project if you want. Say for example, I can call ng after content check, after content checked, after content init, after content checked, after view init, and after view checked in my application directly, even if I have ng on change defined. Say for example, if I want to say call after view init, right? So I can directly define after view init, and here I can call ng after view init, and here I can say after view init. Okay, so what happens now is, if you go to my app component, you see the order route. Okay, I'm just refreshing it. So first the constructor is called, and after that you'll see that after view unit is called, right? So why we require this 4 lifecycle hook, I will tell you. Okay, so what is the real world example apart from the theory? So say, like, when your application is loading, like, your component is loading in your constructor or ng on in it, your HTML is not yet painted. Okay, your browser does not know what to paint on, like what to render on the screen, because nothing is known to your browser still. It is still trying to parse your JavaScript, your TypeScript. So once the JavaScript or the TypeScript code is ready, I'm using TypeScript and JavaScript interchangeably, but when your browser reads it, it will only read the JavaScript file. So we can say it's like, for all practical purpose, it is a JavaScript file. So once it is like reading through your JavaScript file, then it will try to understand, like, what are the HTML content which needs to be rendered, and what are the variable names, and all so on and so forth. So what if you have a scenario, like, say, assume I'll give you a simple scenario. Like, once your application is loaded and you have, like, you want to manipulate some button on your screen. Okay. And as I said before, that button can only be visible on your screen only when that component is loaded actually, right? So to catch those kind of scenarios where, you want to perform some action only when the DOM is ready or the HTML content on your screen is projected, that is why you have this for lifecycle loop. So the only way, like, you want to use something on your application, like, you want to write some code which gets executed only when your HTML is ready. So for that, you can use these lifecycle hooks. Okay. So something like, after content init, or after content checked, after view init, or after view checked. So the predominant lifecycle hook we use is the ng after view unit, which gets triggered only when your, like, the content of the component is like ready to be rendered on the screen. And also you can use after view checked in case, like, you want to just do that operation after all the content on your HTML is checked by the Angular change detection cycle. Okay. So with that being said, let's go and, like, play around with our lifecycle hooks. So here, as I said, like, what we have done right now is, let's do one thing. Okay. So I'll just go to our lazy component one, and here I'll try to kind of, like, take a variable. I'll just take a variable called name. Okay. And I'll progressively assign the value of this name in each of the lifecycle loop, just for you to understand, like, how it works. What I'll do is, first I'll do ng on it. We cannot do ng on change, as I said, because the value of this component itself is not changing. But we'll also look into it in the further course of time once, like, we get into the component communication. So for now, just bear with me. So next time, what I will do is, I'll do the ng after view init. So for that, the simpler way to do is, you just go here, type after view init. It will automatically import it on the top for you. And again, here you just need to do ng after view init. Here you just give it, we'll assign the name later. And we have a ng on destroy, right? So what I'll do over here is, I'll just give it. Okay. So in the constructor, I'm just renaming the name to constructor. On the init, I'll just rename it to on init. On view checked, I will just say it as after view init. And on destroy, I'll just tell it as on destroy, right? So I've done this. So how can I check it if it is actually working or not, right? So what I will do is, I'll just kind of console log this at end of each cycle. Okay, so now we are done. So let's go back to the application, and we just clear the console and load the first module. So you see that, it is calling the same order that we discussed. First the constructor, ng on it, and after view unit, right? And you see right now the on destroy is not called because we are still in the lazy one module, right? But if we click on the module 2, or, like, you just unload this lazy one, you'll see that, on destroy, I am destroyed, right? So always remember that this on destroy cycle will only be called when the component is actually offloaded from your screen. Okay. So I hope with that you are now clear on how this lifecycle hook works. And as a, like, if you are more interested, I would strongly recommend that, just Google up and read about what is the change detection cycle of Angular. That will really help you to, like, cement whatever you have read, like, understood today. And with that, we have come to the summary of the course, so of this week. So as a summary of this week, we have read, like, Angular projects can be split into modules on a broad level based on the functionalities and screens. Inside each modules, you have a bunch of components, directives, services, and other utilities which work together to implement the functionality of the module. Module can be lazily loaded based on the requirement to improve application performance. And we read about what is directives. Directives are the classes that adds in the behavior to our HTML DOM elements. It has its own HTML template called the component. So as we discussed earlier, a component is nothing but a HTML template with the TypeScript logic attached to it. And what is a template is nothing but a bunch of HTML DOM element with additional Angular utilities which helps in extending the behavior of default HTML element. So any HTML file that you write is nothing but a template, because inside that HTML, along with the standard HTML template tags and templates, you can also include your custom or Angular tags behaviors to it. For example, like ng or ng style, those kind of things, or router link. So these are nothing but the Angular utilities which you also write in your HTML. Angular behind the screens will be interpolating them for you. Understood how the data can be passed from the component to HTML or vice versa, either in a one way or a two-way direction. Examples of doing one-way data binding is either you can use string interpolation, you can use property binding or event binding, and a combination of property and event binding is what results in two-way data binding, as we saw with the example of ng model from the stack blitz example that I show you. Then we also discussed about the component lifecycle, where we said right from the instantiation till the destruction, how each lifecycle hooks get called, and how can you write your custom code inside the each lifecycle hook. And this is a reference which I want you to go through for this component overview. So this will give you a further in-depth understanding of what we have done so far. And for your assignment, you all would be getting an assignment for this week, which will predominantly cover whatever we learned so far. So for this week assignment, predominantly we will be covering about we'll be creating a new in the new application, and in that we will be creating a new lazily loaded module, and inside that lazy loaded module you will be just adding a bunch of random photos of your choice. Like you can download some photos from internet or use your own photos and images, and you can use it in the component. And when the component loads, you have to show user an alert that showing photos near you, and when the user is exiting that particular component, you have to show them a message for thanks for visiting the photos of your area. So based on your knowledge of lifecycle hook, you have to implement this functionality. The detailed instruction of this assignment will be given to you. And with that, we have reached to the end of this week's course. Thanks for your time and hope to see you soon. Bye.